Hi, welcome to the Choice Skills Show. I'm your host, George Rogers, and today we're going to be talking about why so many of us are so willing to pay too much for our whistles. Now, what do I mean by that? For those of you who weren't with us in our last show, I'll just briefly review here. We talked about an experience that Benjamin Franklin had in his youth, where he met a boy and bought from him a whistle, giving him all the money that he had. So he went home very pleased with his purchase, blowing the whistle all over the house and probably annoying everybody. And then his brothers and sisters and cousins found out how much he paid for the whistle. They began laughing at him because he had paid 4 times as much for the whistle as it was worth. And so they began putting him in mind of the other things he might have purchased. And all of a sudden, the thing which had brought him so much pleasure brought him pain. And he was upset with himself. But he learned from the experience in the future not to pay too much for his whistles. And he said it was an advantage to him in life. Well, as a homeschooler, as a parent who homeschools, as a parent teacher who doesn't homeschool, all of us are parent teachers. One of the most important things we can teach our children is how to avoid paying too much for their whistles. But in order to do that, we really need to understand why so many of us are so often so willing to pay too much for our whistles.
The answer is found in a word in the English dictionary, cupidity. Cupidity is simple to remember. It rhymes with the word stupidity. The dictionary defines cupidity as an overweening or intense desire. The word overweening means overwhelming or overpowering. It results in a condition I call cupiditis. Cupiditis is an inflammation of the brain that inhibits rational thought. Cupiditis is caused by a tiny little virus called Balir falsus estomitis virus. Or in English, it simply means a false estimate of the value of things. When this happens, the inflammation in the brain seems to block out any degree of common sense and good judgment and all notions of right and wrong that are so important to helping us make sound decisions. As an example, let me share with you the case of Sir Francis Bacon, who in 1618 was appointed Lord Chancellor of England, the highest judicial position in that country. Lord Bacon was perhaps the most gifted mind of the English Renaissance. In addition to law, Bacon made significant contributions in philosophy and science. In writing about England's judicial system, it was Lord Bacon who penned these famous words: "The place of justice is an hallowed place, and therefore ought to be preserved without scandal and corruption." Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, Lord Bacon became infected with the virus Balir falsus estomatis. A severe case of cupiditis set in, and as the inflammation of his brain became more progressive, Bacon's appetite for things eventually overpowered his immense capacity for reason. Lord Bacon developed an insatiable desire for things that require large sums of money to purchase, more money than he could ever possibly earn by honest means. His perceptions of right and wrong became distorted. With creditors nipping at his heels, Lord Bacon abandoned the principles and ideals that had brought him to this high position. In an effort to fix his financial problems, he abused his position of trust, first by accepting bribes, then by actually soliciting them, and finally by outright extortion, threatening to imprison those who refused to pay him for a favorable verdict. In 1621, just 3 years after his appointment as Lord Chancellor, this once great man, who had so much to offer until he became afflicted with this awful disease, was impeached by the House of Commons. Lord Bacon lived out the remainder of his life in shame, semi-poverty, and relative obscurity. Indeed, this man paid too much for his whistles. Another more recent example of cupiditis involving a person in high position was a President of the United States who became involved in what under any circumstance would be considered an inappropriate sexual relationship, and of all places in the Oval Office, one can only say, what was this man thinking? The only answer is, he wasn't. And that, of course, is one of the effects of Cupiditis. At first he denied that he had become involved, but when confronted with DA evidence proving otherwise, he finally admitted and made a public apology for his conduct, and was subjected to the embarrassment of impeachment hearings. Indeed, this was a man who paid way too much for his whistle. It brought him far more pain than it gave him pleasure. It is important in both of these cases to recognize that a simple knowledge of right and wrong is not of itself alone powerful enough to overcome the effects of Cupiditis. As Franklin once described this paradox, is there anything men take more pains about than to render themselves unhappy? Franklin was not being cynical. He was simply acknowledging an all too common human experience. Thank you for being with me. In our next presentation, we'll be taking a look at some of the ways in which people are paying way too much for their whistles and taking a great deal of pains to render themselves unhappy. Our purpose, of course, in doing so is to see if we can't find ways in which we can help our children avoid paying too much for their whistles. And in the process, perhaps we can learn how to avoid paying too much for our own whistles. I think you'll find it an interesting journey, and I look forward to having you join me for our next episode of the Choice Skills Show.